There is a gap in the story of humanity that almost nobody talks about. Not because it's boring, not because there's nothing there, but because what's there doesn't fit the story we've been telling ourselves for centuries, and the discomfort of that mismatch is easier to ignore than to confront. 50,000 years. 50. That's how long human beings exactly like you and me were walking this planet, surviving, loving, fearing, dreaming, mourning, building things, breaking things, and making things that mattered before anyone decided to write any of it down. Before the first pyramid rose from the Egyptian desert, before the first city wall was laid stone by stone in the Fertile Crescent, before the first clay tablet was pressed with a reed stylus by trembling lamplight, somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, by someone trying to remember a debt. 50,000 years of fully modern human beings, with brains wired identically to yours, with the same capacity for language, for music, for grief, for rage, for wonder, for tenderness, and almost none of it recorded, almost none of it remembered. Almost all of it swallowed by time so completely that we have, as a civilization, made the extraordinary decision to simply pretend it wasn't there. Think about what you know about human history. You probably learned about ancient Egypt, about Rome, about Greece, about the rise and fall of great empires on different continents and in different centuries. Maybe you learned about the first cities, about Mesopotamia, and the Fertile Crescent, and the wheel and the plough, and the first written laws, and the first taxes, and the first recorded wars. That's where most history books begin, around 10,000 years ago, give or take. Sometimes a little earlier if the teacher was ambitious. And the story told in those books sounds complete. It sounds authoritative. It sounds like a beginning. Like humanity woke up around 10,000 years ago, looked around at a world it had apparently never noticed before, and decided that it was time to get serious about the whole civilization project. But here's the thing that should make your skin prickle just a little. Anatomically, modern humans have been on this planet for at least 60,000 years. Some evidence pushes that number considerably further back, to perhaps 100,000 years, or even further when you consider the gradual emergence of our species from earlier hominins. And for the vast majority of that time, the story of what we did, where we went, what we feared, what we built, what we lost, what we loved, what we understood about the sky and the earth and each other, that story is almost entirely missing. Not because nothing happened, but because we haven't looked hard enough, or because what we've found doesn't match the stories we already decided were true before we started looking, and it's always easier to ignore inconvenient evidence than to rebuild the story from scratch. The 50,000 years before recorded history aren't a blank page. They are a page that was written in disappearing ink, in wood and bone and leather and song, in materials that don't survive the weight of time the way stone and metal do. A page that's been dissolving for millennia while we built our understanding of human history on the tiny fragment that happened to be made of stuff that lasted long enough for us to find it. And in doing so, we've been telling ourselves a story about who we are that is almost certainly wrong in ways we're only beginning to understand. Tonight, we're going to try to read that disappearing page. Not all of it. That would take 100 lifetimes of careful work, and the world's archaeologists and geneticists and paleoanthropologists are still, painstakingly, putting pieces of it back together. But enough. Enough to change the shape of what you think you know about where you came from. Enough to give back to the people who lived in those 50,000 missing years something of the recognition they deserve. And enough, perhaps, to send you to sleep with a sense of the extraordinary depth of the story you're part of. A story that began not 10,000 years ago, not 50,000 years ago, but in the deep time of human emergence, when the first people who were fully, recognizably us, looked up at a night sky. They had no language yet for mapping, and felt for the first time the particular human ache of wondering what it all meant. Every story has a beginning, or at least we insist that it does. We need a starting point, a moment zero, a place to plant our finger on the map of time and say, here, this is where it started. Everything before this was prologue. Everything after this is the actual story. For the story of human civilization, we've agreed, more or less, that the beginning is somewhere around 10,000 years ago in the ancient Near East, when the first farmers started scratching at soil instead of following herds, when the first people decided to stay in one place long enough to watch a seed become a plant and understand that the connection between the two was something they could control. It's called the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of agriculture, the moment when human beings stopped wandering and started staying in one place, stopped following the world and started reshaping it. And it is a revolution, genuinely. The shift from foraging to farming changed everything about how humans lived, how many of them there were, how they organized themselves socially and politically, what they built, what they ate, and ultimately what they believed about themselves and their place in the world. The story of the last 10,000 years is in many ways the story of what happens after that shift, and it's a fascinating story. But it leaves out 50,000 years. Before the farmers, we're told, there were hunter-gatherers, and before them, there were earlier species of humans, not quite like us, still inching their way toward the cognitive complexity that would eventually make civilization possible. In this version of history, the hunter-gatherers are almost beside the point. They're a prologue. They're the rough draft. They're the people treading water in the shallows of prehistory, waiting for the revolution of agriculture to come along and rescue them from their wandering, purposeless existence. They didn't write anything down. They didn't build anything that lasted. They were just surviving, day after day, season after season, hand to mouth in the wilderness, until one brilliant group of people somewhere in the Fertile Crescent figured out that you could put seeds in the ground and come back for them later, and that insight changed the world. But spend any real time with the archaeological evidence, and this story begins to crack. Not collapse, not fall apart overnight, but crack slowly, the way a ceiling cracks in an old house during a season of heavy rain, letting in light from a place you didn't know existed. Because the more carefully we look at the 50,000 years before agriculture, the harder it becomes to describe those people as simply surviving. The harder it becomes to say they were waiting for civilization to save them. The harder it becomes to pretend that nothing of consequence was happening in those years, that the only things worth calling history didn't begin until someone decided to plant barley. The crack started showing for many researchers with a site in Turkey called Gobekli Tepe. We'll come back to it in detail because it deserves its own conversation. But for now, just hold this single fact and let it sit with you. 12,000 years ago, before pottery was widespread, before writing had been invented, before organized agriculture had taken firm hold across the region, someone built a temple complex on a hilltop in southern Turkey. Not a rough pile of rocks knocked together by people who didn't know any better. Not a windbreak or a storage pit or a simple shelter from the elements. A deliberately engineered complex of massive carved pillars, some of them standing more than 5 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons each, decorated with intricate carvings of animals and abstract symbols. The engineering required to quarry those stones, to transport them to the hilltop, to raise them, to set them in place without any of the tools we associate with the word civilization, that engineering alone should give us pause. But the carvings change everything. because carvings mean symbolic thought. Carvings mean someone looked at a block of raw limestone and imagined a fox there, imagined it clearly enough to spend weeks or months coaxing the image out of the stone with patient, obsessive, beautiful labor. And that is not the behavior of people who are merely surviving from one day to the next. That is the behavior of people who have an interior life so rich and so insistent that it spills out of their hands. The crack widens. And once it widens, you start to see through it into the 50,000 years that are supposed to be empty. And what you see there is not emptiness. It is a world so dense with human life, human ingenuity, human fear, and human hope that the only surprising thing is how thoroughly we managed to convince ourselves it wasn't there. How thoroughly we built our entire story of humanity around the 10,000 years at the top of the stack, the 10,000 years that left stone and metal and fired clay, while quietly, systematically, without quite admitting we were doing it, ignoring the 50,000 years below that left mostly organic material and silence. It wasn't malice. It wasn't conspiracy. It was just the natural bias of working with what survives, of building a story from the evidence available rather than from the evidence that once existed. But the cost of that bias has been a story about humanity that is almost certainly wrong in its most fundamental claim, the claim that history began 10,000 years ago with the first farmers, and that everything before that was merely biological backstory, not yet worthy of the name. Let's start with the most important thing, the thing that most history books rush past in a single throwaway sentence, as though it were a minor administrative detail. The people who lived in those 50,000 missing years were not primitive. They were not proto-humans inching their way toward intelligence. They were not rough sketches of human beings, still waiting for the lines to be filled in. They were finished. They were complete. They were us. The human brain reached its current size and general structure roughly 200,000 years ago, and possibly earlier than that. The specific architecture of the modern brain, the particular relationships between regions that allow for complex language, for abstract reasoning, for the ability to imagine future states and plan backwards from them, for the capacity to hold conflicting ideas simultaneously and reason about the conflict, all of that was essentially in place long before the last ice age ended, long before the first farmer pressed the first seed into the first furrow. By the time we reach the 50,000 years we're talking about, the people walking the earth had the same cognitive capacity as you do, the same working memory, the same ability to plan for outcomes that won't materialize for weeks or months, the same ability to use language with nuance and irony and ambiguity, the same capacity for the full spectrum of human emotion from terror to tenderness, from paralyzing boredom to the particular electric joy of solving a difficult problem. From grief so heavy it makes movement seem impossible to love so large, it feels like it could illuminate a cave. The brain sitting inside an ancient hunter-gatherer's skull was not a simpler version of yours. It was not a version 1 that would eventually, through the accumulation of cultural progress, become the more sophisticated version 2 that you're running now. It was yours. The same processor, the same architecture, the same raw capacity. Just running on different information, shaped by different experiences, trained by a different environment into different patterns of expertise and knowledge. This changes everything about how you should picture those people. When you imagine a human being 50,000 years ago, don't picture a grunting, stooped figure squinting suspiciously from the mouth of a cave. Picture a person of completely equivalent intelligence sitting across a table from you. Someone who could learn to use a smartphone in an afternoon if you handed them one and explained the basic premise. Someone who could learn to read and write within a few years, if given the instruction and the opportunity. Someone who laughed at jokes, almost certainly some of them obscene or absurdist, or at the expense of a mutual acquaintance. Someone who told stories to their children at night, stories with characters and consequences and moral complexity. Someone who worried about the same people they always worried about, who felt the same hollow ache of grief when they lost someone they loved, who lay awake sometimes in the dark, staring at the ceiling of their shelter and wondering, in whatever form the wondering took, what any of it was for. The difference between them and you is not intelligence. The difference is accumulated knowledge. They didn't have books. They didn't have a written record of every discovery their grandparents had made, every technique for growing food, every map of every river, every lesson hard-won from every mistake made by every person who came before them. They had to rediscover things or keep knowledge alive through oral tradition, which is a technology of tremendous beauty and also of considerable fragility, since for a story to survive, someone must always be telling it to someone, and the chain of transmission can be broken by violence or famine, or simply by the absence of a willing listener at the critical moment. But that's a difference of information, not of capacity. It's a difference in the library available to them, not in the brain they brought to the reading. Given what they knew and what they had, many of the people of the 50,000 missing years were doing things that should astonish us. Things we've been underestimating partly out of ignorance, and partly, I think, out of a kind of intellectual self-congratulation, the need to believe that what we've built is so advanced that the distance between us and them is unbridgeable, that we are not just later in the story, but fundamentally different in kind. We are not different in kind. We are later in the story. And the story, it turns out, started much more compellingly than we gave it credit for. To understand the 50,000 missing years, you have to understand the world those people were navigating, not as a set of abstract geological facts, but as a lived environment, a landscape with weight and smell and danger and beauty that shaped every decision, every movement, every form of knowledge those people needed in order to remain alive. Because it was a world profoundly different from the one we inhabit. Different in scale, different in character, different in the nature of the threats it posed and the opportunities it offered. 50,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last ice age, specifically a phase of it characterized by expanding ice sheets and falling global temperatures that created conditions across the northern hemisphere very different from anything alive today. Not the cartoon ice age of frozen wastelands and mammoths preserved in perfect ice, though some of those elements were real, but a world substantially colder, drier in many regions, and with sea levels dramatically lower than they are today, because enormous volumes of water that now circulate through the ocean system were locked up in continental ice sheets kilometers thick. Sea levels were perhaps 120 meters lower than current levels at the glacial maximum. 120 meters. Try to hold that number in your mind as a physical reality rather than an abstraction. What that difference in sea level meant for human beings is that the map of the world was fundamentally different. Britain was not an island. It was connected to continental Europe by a vast lowland plain, sometimes called Doggerland, that covered what is now the southern North Sea and the English Channel, a landscape of rivers, marshes, forests and hunting grounds that was home to human populations for tens of thousands of years before the sea eventually swallowed it. The islands of Southeast Asia, many of them separate today, were connected to the mainland in a configuration so different from the current map that the region has its own name in geological discussions: Sunderland. The huge landmass that is now submerged beneath the South China Sea And the Java Sea was once dry land, a continent-scale landscape connecting what is now mainland Southeast Asia to the large islands of the Indonesian archipelago. And Beringia, the land bridge that connected northeastern Asia to Alaska, was not a narrow crossing, but a wide subcontinent in its own right, hundreds of kilometers across, with its own distinct ecology. The implications for human archaeology are profound and often underappreciated. Coastal areas are exactly where hunter-gatherer populations tend to concentrate, because coastlines provide an extraordinary abundance of food. Shellfish, fish, sea mammals, marine birds, the resources of adjacent forests and grasslands. If early humans were living along coastlines, which they certainly were, the sites where they lived are now underwater, in some cases under more than 100 meters of ocean. We are not just dealing with time erasing the evidence. We are dealing with oceans literally burying it under their floors. The coastal archaeological record of 50,000 years ago is mostly inaccessible to us, not because people weren't there, but because where they were is now permanently beneath the sea. The climate fluctuated dramatically across the 50,000 years we're talking about. There were periods of relative warmth where conditions across large parts of the world were not entirely unlike the present. There were periods of intense cold where ice sheets advanced deep into middle latitudes, and the remaining habitable land was reduced to scattered refugia, pockets of relative abundance separated by vast hostile stretches of tundra or desert. There were rapid transitions between these states, climate shifts that played out not over centuries but over decades, in some cases over years, transforming landscapes at a pace that human populations had to match or perish. The megafauna of this world were real, living, contemporary animals, not mythological creatures from some distant fairy tale era. Woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses roamed across the tundra and cold grasslands of northern Eurasia. Cave lions, bigger than any lion alive today, prowled the forests and steppes of Europe. Cave bears, enormous creatures dwarfing modern brown bears, occupied caves across Europe and Asia. In the Americas, mastodons and mammoths shared the landscape with ground sloths as large as modern elephants, with short-faced bears of terrifying size, with multiple species of horse and camel that are now extinct on that continent. The giant deer of Europe, sometimes called the Irish elk, carried antlers spanning nearly 4 meters. The landscape those people navigated was populated by animals that had no reason to fear humans, because in most places they had never encountered them before, which made some of the hunting extraordinarily dangerous, and which may explain, at least in part, the emphasis on powerful animals in the cave art of that period. The mammoths and the cave lions and the aurochs rendered with an attention and a care that might be reverence, or might be something more like professional respect from one formidable creature for another. They moved through this world, those people with knowledge of it that is genuinely difficult for most modern humans to appreciate. Not romantic knowledge, not spiritual knowledge in the vague sense in which we sometimes use that word when we want to sound admiring without getting specific. Operational knowledge, survival knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is tested every day against the reality of the world and either proves correct or gets you killed. The knowledge of which stones in this particular riverbed would produce a flake with the right edge geometry for the task at hand. The knowledge of which direction the prevailing wind came from, and what that meant for approaching the aurochs herd, grazing in the valley below without being scented. The knowledge of which berry clusters on which specific plants were safe to eat, and at exactly what stage of ripeness. The knowledge of how to read a night sky without any of the astronomical frameworks that modern navigation depends on, using only the patterns themselves, the position of stars, their rising and setting points, the tilt of the moon, to find direction across a featureless plain. This knowledge was not simple. It was the product of thousands of years of accumulated observation, maintained and transmitted through the oral traditions of the people who needed it to survive. And most of it is gone. Here is the central tragedy of the 50,000 missing years. The reason the story remains missing even as archaeology slowly and painstakingly fills in its outlines. Most of what those people built was built from organic materials. Wood, bone, hide, fiber, feather, bark, plant material of every kind. And organic materials in most environments don't last. A wooden house in temperate soil becomes a few darkened stains in the earth within a few thousand years. A leather bag disappears without a trace within decades of being abandoned, in most conditions. A basket, a net, a rope, a wooden spear shaft, a woven blanket, a garment sewn from animal skins. All of these things require extraordinary conditions of preservation to survive even a few millennia. Conditions like extreme cold, extreme aridity, or immersion in waterlogged anaerobic sediment. In most places, in most soils, they simply vanish. What survives is stone, occasionally bone, sometimes shell, sometimes fired clay where it exists, sometimes pigment used in art. The hard mineral evidence of a world that was, in its daily texture and lived experience, almost entirely made of soft things. And from stone and bone alone, archaeologists have built a picture of early human life that is necessarily partial, necessarily distorted, necessarily weighted toward the things that happened to survive, rather than the things that actually mattered most to the people who lived them. It's a picture with almost all the soft materials edited out. The tools remain, but most of the objects those tools were used to make have vanished. The arrow points remain, but the arrows they tipped have dissolved. The stone scrapers remain, but the hides they processed are dust. The grinding stones remain, but the plant materials they processed are gone. The ochre remains, used in painting, in body decoration, in rituals we can barely guess at. But the bodies it decorated are long returned to earth, and the ceremonies it coloured are entirely silent. This creates a systematic, structural bias in our understanding of early human life. The things that survive the millennia are the hardest, most durable things, and these tend to be the most utilitarian things, the infrastructure of survival, the sharp edges and the grinding surfaces. What gets lost in almost every case is everything else. The spiritual life, the social complexity, the art on perishable surfaces, the music, the stories, the relationships. The things that make a culture rather than just a collection of physical implements. We've been trying to understand the lives of people by looking at their most discardable tools while their most treasured possessions are dust. And then there's the sheer scale of time working against us. 10,000 years is long enough to bury a site deeply, to scatter its contents through erosion, to distort its stratigraphy through the action of roots and burrowing animals and percolating groundwater. 50,000 years multiplies all of those processes fivefold. A site occupied 50,000 years ago might be buried under 4 or 5 meters of accumulated sediment. It might have been covered by volcanic ash from an eruption thousands of kilometers away. It might have been reshaped by glacial action. It might be underwater. It might have been built over by later populations, leaving a stratified mess of mixed ages and contexts that is extraordinarily difficult to disentangle. The archaeologist working at a 50,000-year-old site is not looking for a needle in a haystack. They're looking for a needle that may have dissolved in a haystack that has been compressed into rock and scattered across a continent by tectonic activity. Despite all of this, despite the systematic bias towards stone and the crushing weight of geological time, the evidence that does survive is increasingly remarkable and increasingly difficult to fit into the old story of primitive people waiting for civilization to rescue them. Take the Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. Excavations there have revealed a sequence of occupation layers reaching back nearly 100,000 years. And what's in those layers has been changing the conversation about the cognitive capabilities of early modern humans since the site was first systematically excavated in the 1990s. Archaeologists found engraved ochre pieces bearing geometric patterns that are clearly intentional and symbolic. Not random scratching, not unintentional marks, but deliberate designs, repeated across multiple pieces with evident purpose. They found shell beads, perforated for stringing, representing the oldest personal ornaments yet found in the world. And they found the remains of what appears to be an organized ochre processing and storage facility. Ochre pieces ground to powder, bone tools used for grinding, charcoal mixed in, abalone shells used as containers for the mixture. A paint-making workshop, equipped and maintained, nearly 100,000 years ago. For what purpose? Body decoration? Ritual painting of objects or surfaces that haven't survived? We can only speculate. But the organization and deliberateness of the practice is unmistakable. This is not casual behavior. This is practiced, intentional, purposeful activity carried out by people who knew what they were doing and why. There is a particular kind of silence in the 50,000 missing years that is harder to bear than the absence of buildings or tools or art. It is the silence of the voices, the complete, absolute, irreversible absence of what those people said to each other across all those years. What they believed about the world, what stories they told their children at night to help them understand what lightning was and what happened after death, and why the sun moved across the sky, and whether the stars cared about human beings at all. What they thought about the nature of consciousness, what they called the things they loved, what words in what languages of extraordinary diversity they used to express grief and gratitude and desire, and the particular exhaustion that follows a day of hard, physical work. What jokes they told when the hunting had been good, and there was more food than the immediate necessity required, and someone's mood lifted into something more expansive than survival. All of it, gone. We know they talked. We know their language was complex and capable because the brain structures required for complex language were already fully in place. And because the behaviors we observe in the archaeological record, the planning, the coordination, the apparent ritual, the long-distance procurement of specific materials, all of those behaviors require complex communication to organize. You cannot coordinate a group of people in a complex hunting strategy using only gestures and grunts. You cannot maintain and transmit the technical knowledge required to heat-treat stone, to improve its fracture properties across generations using a communication system of limited complexity. We know they talked, we know their language was rich, but we will never hear a single word of what they said. Not one sentence from 50,000 years of human conversation has come down to us. Not one. The most ancient written texts we possess, the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, the hieroglyphic inscriptions of early Egypt, are separated from the beginning of the 50,000 missing years by 40,000 years of silence. Everything spoken in that gap is gone. The accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations, the cosmologies that tried to explain the universe, the ethical frameworks that governed how people should treat each other, the stories that gave meaning to death and birth and love and loss, The jokes and the songs and the arguments and the declarations and the murmured prayers in the dark. All of it gone, so completely that we have no way to know even what shape it had, what the grammar of those extinct languages was, what categories they carved the world into, what things mattered to the people who spoke them. This is one of those losses that becomes more, rather than less, devastating the longer you sit with it. It's easy to feel abstractly sad about lost civilizations, lost languages, lost knowledge. But try to feel it concretely. Try to imagine a specific person, a woman perhaps, somewhere in what is now France, 40,000 years ago. She's sitting near a fire, and the fire is casting light on the cave wall where the horses are painted. Horses she may have helped paint herself, or that her parents painted before her, and she's talking. She's talking to someone she loves. In a language that is by any linguistic measure a fully functional, fully complex human language. A language with a vocabulary of thousands of words, with a grammar capable of expressing past and future, and counterfactual and conditional, and all the tenses and moods that human experience requires. She's saying something that matters to the person she's talking to. Maybe she's telling a story. Maybe she's expressing a fear. Maybe she's making an argument about something she believes deeply. Maybe she's saying something so funny that it makes the person across the fire from her cover their mouth to stifle a laugh, and the laugh escapes anyway and rings off the cave walls, and the horses painted there are still for just a moment. That woman was real. That conversation was real. Those words were real, and we will never know a single one of them. The handprints on cave walls, which we'll talk about in more detail, are partly about this. Partly about the desire to leave something that speaks in the absence of words. The hand is the self before language, the most direct possible inscription of physical presence on the world. You press your hand against the cold stone, and you blow the pigment, and what remains is the shape of you. The exact, unmistakable silhouette of your specific hand, which no other hand in the world will ever exactly match. And it says, without language, the one thing that needed to be said, I was here. If you want to understand just how much the standard story of human history needs revising, you don't have to go all the way back into the deep past of the 50,000 missing years. You only have to go to the edge, to the threshold between the world before writing and the world after. And there, on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, in a region of rolling limestone hills between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, you find Gobekli Tepe. And once you've sat with what it means, the comfortable old story of civilization starting with agriculture never quite sounds the same again. Gobekli Tepe was first noted by a Kurdish shepherd in the 1960s, who reported the finding to a local museum. The unusual stones were mentioned briefly in a survey in the 1960s, but largely dismissed as the remains of a medieval Byzantine cemetery. It wasn't until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, visiting the site as part of a research project, recognized the true nature of what had been found. The protruding stones were not medieval gravestones. They were the tops of massive carved limestone pillars, the largest of them 5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, emerging from sediment that turned out to be not a natural accumulation, but a deliberate fill, a conscious burial of enormous artificial structures beneath layer upon layer of stone rubble. Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating at Gobekli Tepe, until his death in 2014. What his team found, and what subsequent researchers have continued to uncover, is something that continues to resist easy interpretation. The site consists of multiple circular and oval enclosures defined by T-shaped limestone pillars set upright in stone benches. The pillars themselves are extraordinary objects. their T-shape apparently representing stylized human figures from a frontal view, with the horizontal bar of the T suggesting arms and the vertical bar suggesting the body. On many pillars carved in relief are animals of remarkable variety. Foxes and boars, cranes and vultures, scorpions and snakes, lions and ducks, and abstract symbols that appear again and again without yet being deciphered. Some pillars show human hands and the edges of garments. Some show animals in dynamic poses, leaping, twisting, confronting each other. The carving is skilled, detailed, often beautiful in ways that produce an aesthetic response across 12,000 years of cultural distance. The date is what matters most here. The oldest enclosures at Gobekli Tepe have been dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. This is a date that places the construction firmly in the late Paleolithic or early Epipaleolithic, in a period when agriculture was not yet widespread in the region, when pottery was largely absent, when none of the material markers we associate with civilization in the conventional sense were present. The people who built Gobekli Tepe were, by the standard classification, hunter-gatherers. People who followed game and gathered plant foods across seasonal territories. People who, in the old story of human development, were supposed to be too busy surviving to think about building stone temples. And yet, they built it. They quarried limestone from bedrock and shaped it into massive pillars. They moved those pillars, some of them weighing up to 20 tons, from quarry sites to the hilltop, somehow, with some combination of ropes and sledges and human effort, at a scale that required coordinating large numbers of people over extended periods of time. They erected those pillars with precision, positioning them in configurations that were clearly planned, not random. They decorated them with a rich, symbolic vocabulary that implies a coherent mythology or cosmological system complex enough to generate repeated, recognizable imagery across multiple construction phases. And they did all of this, apparently, not as an accidental byproduct of some other activity, but as a primary purpose. The site appears to be a ceremonial complex. There is little evidence of permanent domestic occupation. People came here to build and to do whatever it was the building was for. The question of what it was for is the most fascinating one, and it doesn't have a clean answer. It might have been a site for community gatherings, a pilgrimage destination, or a neutral meeting ground for multiple hunter-gatherer bands occupying the wider region. It might have been a place for initiation rituals, for ceremonies marking seasonal transitions, for communication with ancestors, or with non-human powers of various kinds. The animal imagery, dominated by predators and scavengers in ways that might suggest associations with death and the afterlife, has led some researchers to propose connections with beliefs about the passage of souls or the mediation between the living and the dead. We don't know, we can't know with the current evidence, but the intentionality is unmistakable and the scale is extraordinary. What Gobekli Tepe did to the conventional story of civilization is what concerned us here. In the old model, the sequence ran clearly from food production to surplus to specialization to complex social organization to monument building to religion. First, you feed everyone reliably, then you develop a division of labor. Then you get specialists, then you get social stratification, then you get the ideological superstructure of organized religion, and eventually you get the architecture that expresses all of that. That's the story. And Gobekli Tepe breaks it, because Gobekli Tepe was built before widespread agriculture in the region, by hunter-gatherers, without pottery, without writing, without any of the supposedly prerequisite stages. Which means either that complex social organization and the ideological and ceremonial life that goes with it don't require agriculture after all, or something more provocative. that the causation might run in the opposite direction. That it was Gobekli Tepe and sites like it that made agriculture necessary by creating large gatherings of people at sacred sites that hunter-gatherer foraging alone couldn't sustain, by generating a demand for reliable food supplies at predictable times and places that nudged populations toward the deliberate cultivation of wild plants. Religion, in this reading, didn't come after civilization. It preceded it. The sacred came before the practical. The impulse to build something devoted to whatever those pillars were devoted to came before the granary, before the ploughed field, before the city wall. Whether that's true in its full form remains debated, but the debate itself is an index of how thoroughly Gobekli Tepe disrupted the old story. Here is a thing that should fundamentally, permanently alter the way you think about the 50,000 missing years. And it's a thing that most popular history still handles awkwardly when it handles it at all. For most of those 50,000 years, modern humans were not the only humans on the planet. They shared the world with others. Other species or subspecies of the genus Homo, beings closely enough related to us that we sometimes interbred with them, but distinct enough that they represented genuinely different evolutionary experiments in what it meant to be human. Different answers to the question of how a large-brained primate could organize itself to survive in the world. Neanderthals. They are perhaps the most familiar of our close relatives, and also the most consistently misrepresented. The image of the Neanderthal as a shambling, low-browed brute dragging a club through a perpetual fog of stupidity is one of the most durable and most inaccurate scientific misconceptions of the last century. The real Neanderthals, reconstructed from an increasingly rich fossil and archaeological record across Europe and Western Asia, were something altogether more interesting than that caricature. They had brains that were, on average, larger than ours. Not organized identically to ours, but large. They made tools of considerable sophistication, not just opportunistic flakes struck from handy rocks, but deliberate, multi-step reduction strategies requiring planning and prediction of how a particular stone would fracture under controlled percussion. They controlled fire and used it to prepare food, to provide warmth, to work materials. They were capable of hunting large, dangerous prey, including woolly rhinoceroses and woolly mammoths, prey that requires cooperative strategy and communication to kill without dying. They almost certainly had language, though the exact form and complexity of it remains disputed, because the anatomical structures required for the production of speech were present in their fossils, and because their behaviors imply levels of social coordination that would be very difficult to achieve without spoken communication of some complexity. And they persisted. They lived in Europe for at least 300,000 years before modern humans arrived. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 300,000 years. They survived multiple glacial cycles. They survived the advance and retreat of ice sheets across their entire range. They survived climate shifts that repeatedly transformed the landscapes they depended on. They adapted, repeatedly, to new conditions, developing new tool-making traditions, expanding and contracting their range as conditions permitted, maintaining populations across tens of thousands of years of continuous challenge. They were not failures. They were not an evolutionary dead end that modern humans improved on in every way. They were a different, successful experiment in being human that happened to end when it encountered modern humans. And the ending might have been violent, or competitive, or epidemiological, or some combination of all three. But it was not inevitable. And before it ended, something else happened. Something that changed the story in a way we only discovered conclusively in 2010. In that year, Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, extracted from ancient bone fragments found in Croatian caves. The results were unambiguous. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This is not an error. This is not contamination from the researchers handling the samples. This is the genetic legacy of actual, physical interbreeding events, somewhere in the Middle East or Western Asia, roughly 40 to 60,000 years ago, when modern humans moving out of Africa encountered Neanderthal populations already living in those regions. They met. In some of those meetings, children were born. Those children's descendants survived. And the genetic trace of those encounters is sitting in your genome right now. In mine. In almost every non-African person on Earth. When you look at your own body, when you look at the faces of your children or your parents or the strangers on the street, you are looking at the legacy of encounters between our ancestors and beings who were definitively not us, and yet close enough to us, similar enough in biology and perhaps in something more than biology, that the encounters produced viable offspring who went on to live full human lives. The Denisovans are stranger still, and more haunting precisely because we know so little of them. They are known almost entirely from 3 tiny bone fragments found in a single cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. A fragment of a finger bone, 2 teeth. From those 3 small pieces of ancient bone, scientists managed to extract enough ancient DNA to identify an entirely unknown human population, genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals, that occupied Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. We cannot reconstruct their appearance from the DNA alone, not with any confidence. We have almost none of their material culture, no art we can confidently attribute to them, no ritual objects, no structures. We know they were real because their genes are real, detectable in living people, but what they looked like, how they organized themselves, what they believed about the world, what language they spoke, none of this we know. They existed for hundreds of thousands of years and left almost no trace except in the genomes of their living descendants. And those descendants are real. The indigenous peoples of Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA in their genomes, a substantially higher proportion than any other modern population. Which means that the ancestors of those people, the extraordinary voyagers who crossed open ocean to reach Australia at least 50,000 years ago, carried in their bodies the genetic legacy of an encounter with a human population that Western science didn't know existed until 2010. The story of human diversity in Asia was more complex, more populated with different kinds of human beings, more entangled across species boundaries than we had imagined. And the full shape of that complexity is still emerging, as more ancient genomes are sequenced and more patterns of introgression and admixture are identified. The 50,000 missing years were not a quiet pastoral interlude between earlier, more violent evolutionary history and the dramatic emergence of civilization. They were punctuated at irregular intervals by catastrophes of a scale that should command as much attention as any event in recorded history. Genuine civilization-shattering, population-crashing events that left their signatures in the geological and genetic record as unmistakable evidence of things so large and so terrible that the world on the other side of them was genuinely different from the world before. The one that commands the most attention, the one that some researchers believe came closest to ending the story of our species entirely, is the Toba supervolcanic eruption. It occurred approximately 74,000 years ago on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, and it was not an ordinary volcanic event. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years, possibly the largest in the last 25 million years. The scale of what happened is difficult to render in concrete terms, but let's try. The eruption ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, an amount so large that it formed a caldera, a collapsed volcanic depression, roughly 100 kilometers long and 35 kilometers wide. The ash from the eruption spread across the Indian subcontinent in a layer in some places, several meters thick. It crossed the Indian Ocean. It reached the Arabian Peninsula and eastern Africa. In the atmosphere, the vast quantities of sulfur dioxide released by the eruption reacted with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols that scattered and absorbed incoming solar radiation for months and possibly years, creating what geologists and climatologists call a volcanic winter. The global mean temperature dropped. By how much and for how long is a matter of scientific debate, with estimates ranging from a few degrees for a few years to more severe and prolonged cooling. What is not debated is that it dropped, and that the consequences for terrestrial ecosystems were severe. Plant growth faltered, animal populations fell, food webs were disrupted at their base. The question of what Toba did to early modern human populations is one of the most hotly debated topics in paleoanthropology. The hypothesis that it produced a genetic bottleneck in our species, reducing the global human population to somewhere between a few thousand and perhaps 20,000 individuals, was proposed by Stanley Ambrose in the 1990s and has been revisited and contested extensively since. The genetic evidence for a population bottleneck around this time period is real. Modern humans show considerably less genetic diversity than would be expected for a species of our age, which is consistent with a dramatic population reduction followed by expansion from a small, surviving group. Whether Toba was the cause of that bottleneck or whether other factors contributed is still debated. What is not really debated is that people survived. Whatever Toba did to human populations, whether it nearly ended the species or simply reduced it severely or affected it less dramatically than the most extreme hypotheses suggest, people came through the other side. They were still making stone tools on the other side of the Toba ash layer in India. They were still moving, still adapting, still maintaining the social and cultural bonds required to keep knowledge alive through a period of catastrophic environmental stress. The survival of our species through events like Toba is not automatic. It required all of the qualities that define the 50,000 missing years at their most impressive: flexibility, intelligence, cooperation, the ability to shift strategies when the environment shifted, and perhaps most of all, the stubborn refusal to stop being human, to stop making culture, to stop maintaining the social fabric, even in conditions where the immediate priority of every biological system was simply to get enough calories to stay alive. And Toba was not the only catastrophe. The entire sweep of the 50,000 missing years was punctuated by dramatic climate events, glacial advances and retreats, megadroughts, floods, the collapse of food webs. The people who lived through those events were not passive victims. They were agents responding with all the intelligence and flexibility their modern human brains afforded them, finding new food sources, moving to new territories, maintaining and adapting their cultural knowledge, doing what humans do under pressure, which is, eventually, find a way through. Of all the things that happened in the 50,000 missing years, perhaps the most dramatic in terms of sheer human achievement and human story are the migrations, the great movements of people across the face of the planet, over tens of thousands of years, into environments that range from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, from sea-level coastlines to the high, cold plateaus of the Tibetan highlands, from the richly abundant to the genuinely, punishingly hostile. In terms of geographic spread, the 50,000 years we're discussing represent one of the most dramatic expansions of any species in the history of life on Earth. And it happened not through any biological change in the species doing the expanding, but through culture, through the accumulation and transmission of knowledge that allowed people to survive in environments where no human had ever survived before. Modern humans left Africa at some point between 50 and 70,000 years ago, possibly in multiple waves over an extended period, possibly through multiple routes. The first wave appears to have moved along the southern coast of Asia, following the coastline east through what is now southern India, Sri Lanka, and eventually into Southeast Asia. This was not a planned expedition. It was not a migration in the sense of a deliberate decision to leave one place and travel to another. It was, almost certainly, a gradual expansion over many generations, as populations grew and moved into adjacent territories, following game, following coastlines, following the basic logic of finding more food in the next place than you could find in the current one. But spread across thousands of generations, this gradual expansion added up to something extraordinary. By roughly 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier, human beings had reached Australia and New Guinea, and they had done so in a way that required the most remarkable thing in the entire story of the 50,000 missing years. They had crossed open ocean. The colonization of Australia is the first unambiguous evidence we have of deliberate maritime navigation by our species. And it is unambiguous because there is no way around it, even during the glacial maximum when sea levels were at their lowest, when Sunderland was a vast connected landmass, extending deep into what is now the Indonesian archipelago. There was still a minimum crossing of at least 60 to 70 kilometers of open water between the last island visible from Southeast Asia and the first shore of what would become Australia. 60 to 70 kilometers. That's the minimum. In some scenarios, the crossing might have been considerably longer. There is no possibility that people drifted across that distance accidentally on floating logs. Not in numbers sufficient to establish a viable founding population. They had to have intentionally built or gathered some kind of vessel capable of carrying multiple people, providing enough stability to remain afloat through ocean swells and weather, and sustaining life long enough to complete a crossing that would have taken at minimum several days of active navigation. They had to have navigated without landmarks, using whatever techniques they had developed for finding direction across open water. The position of stars, the behavior of ocean swells, the flight patterns of birds, the shapes of clouds forming over distant land. They had to have believed, or at least hoped sufficiently to act on the hope, that there was something worth crossing to on the other side, even though no one they knew had ever seen it. The first people who landed on the Australian shore were not doing something primitive. They were doing something so ambitious and so technically demanding that it represents, in its own terms, an achievement of the same order as any of the great maritime explorations of the historical era. And they were doing it 50,000 years ago, before pottery, before agriculture, before writing, before any of the material markers we use to define civilization. They did it with tools made of stone and bone and wood. They did it with knowledge held in human memory and transmitted in human speech. They did it with whatever combination of courage and calculation and desperate hope drove people into the open sea with an unknown destination, knowing that if they were wrong about what lay ahead, they would die. They were not wrong. There is a particular category of site found on multiple continents, in caves and rock shelters from Europe to Africa to Australia to Southeast Asia and the Americas, that I keep returning to in my thinking about the 50,000 missing years. Not because any single example is the most spectacular or the most ancient or the most technically accomplished piece of evidence we have, but because they are, in aggregate, the closest thing we have to a direct message from those people to us. The closest thing to a word spoken across the silence of 50,000 years. The caves with art, the ochre handprints, the painted animals, the engraved symbols. The places where people went deep into the earth, into total darkness, carrying fire for light, and made something. Made it deliberately, skillfully, with evident purpose in places that cost effort and courage to reach, and left it there, in the dark. The caves of Lascaux in the Dordogne region of France, discovered by a group of teenagers and their dog in 1940, and dated to approximately 17,000 years ago, remain perhaps the most famous of these sites, and they are justifiably famous. The paintings there represent some of the most accomplished animal art in the entire human tradition. A gallery of bulls and horses and deer and rhinoceroses rendered with a mastery of form and movement that genuinely astonishes trained artists who see them. The great bull at Lascaux, roughly 5 meters long, captures the physical weight and presence of the animal in a way that no description can quite do justice to. The swimming deer, their heads held high above invisible water, convey in a single image the quality of animal life in motion, the specific aliveness of animals moving through their world that makes the person who painted them feel simultaneously very far away in time and very close in sensibility. But Lascaux, magnificent as it is not the oldest. The caves of Chauvet in the Ardèche region of France, discovered in 1994, contain paintings dated to more than 35,000 years ago, more than twice the age of Lascaux. And they are not primitive forerunners of the Lascaux paintings. They are comparable in skill and ambition and artistic sophistication. The lions of Chauvet, painted in charcoal and ochre, occupy the wall of the cave with a presence so vivid and so confident that paleontologist and filmmaker Werner Herzog, who made a documentary about the cave, described feeling watched by them. The cave bear skulls arranged on a stone in one chamber of Chauvet, apparently deliberately placed there, suggest a ritual context, some ceremony involving bears whose meaning we cannot recover, but whose intentionality is unmistakable. And Chauvet is not the oldest. In 2019, researchers working in the Leang Bulu Sipong cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi published a finding that reset the calendar entirely. A scene painted on the cave wall depicting human-like figures hunting warty pigs and dwarf buffalo was dated to at least 45,000 years ago, making it the oldest known figurative narrative scene in the world. The scene is remarkable not just for its age but for its content. It's not a single animal, not a single hand. It's a story, figures in spatial and apparent causal relationship to each other, arranged to depict an event unfolding in time. Narrative art, at 45,000 years old. And in Australia, some hand stencils and rock art have been dated even earlier, with the oldest known Australian rock art currently dated to at least 17,000 years ago, and the tradition clearly going back much further, potentially to the very first human arrival on the continent 50,000 years ago. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia maintain the oldest known continuous artistic and cultural tradition in the world, a tradition that may extend back to that first landing, that has been continuously practiced and transmitted for 50,000 years. 50,000 years of people making art in the same place, looking at the same landscape, telling, in some form, the same stories. The handprints are the thing that stops me completely when I think about them. Found in caves on every inhabited continent. Hand stencils created by pressing the hand against the cave wall and blowing pigment around it through a tube of bone or bark, leaving the silhouette of the hand in negative against the coloured surface. Sometimes painted flat by applying pigment directly, sometimes hundreds of hands in a single gallery. The oldest confirmed handprints in the world are from a cave in Sulawesi and are dated to more than 40,000 years ago, though the tradition probably extends further. Why? Why go deep into a cave, in total darkness, to leave the outline of your hand on the wall? Ritual, almost certainly. The specific ritual meaning, we can't recover. Ceremony, initiation, communication with spirits of some kind, a record of presence, a claim on the place, a gift to future visitors. All of these have been proposed. But underneath whatever specific ceremonial function the act served is something simpler and more universal. The desire to mark the world with evidence of your own existence. The desire to say, in the most irreducible possible way, I was here. I was real. My hand touched this stone. My breath blew this pigment. I existed in this place, in this body, on this day. 35,000 years later, an archaeologist's headlamp falls on that outline, and the message, impossibly, arrives. The person is not invisible, the person is not forgotten. For a moment, across the impossible distance of all those years, the ceremony worked. One of the most unsettling implications of the 50,000 missing years is not what we lost in terms of art or ceremony or story, though the loss of those things is genuinely profound and genuinely worth mourning. It's what we may have lost in terms of knowledge. Hard, practical, empirically derived, life-critical knowledge about the world, developed over generations of careful observation and rigorous testing, and encoded in forms that didn't survive the transition to writing-based civilization. The people of the 50,000 missing years were not the inheritors of a formal scientific tradition with its institutions and methodologies and journals and peer review. But they were, in their own way, scientists, not in the institutional sense, but in the most fundamental sense, the sense that matters most. They were people systematically observing the world, forming hypotheses about its behavior, testing those hypotheses against direct experience, and updating their understanding accordingly. And this process, carried out across thousands of generations by populations, with strong incentives to get it right, because getting it wrong could mean dying, produced bodies of knowledge whose depth and sophistication we are only now beginning to appreciate. Consider pharmacological knowledge. Hunter-gatherer societies in every part of the world maintained extensive knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants, not based on theory, based on empirical observation accumulated over generations of what happened when people consumed or applied various plant materials to various conditions. Some of this knowledge has survived in the oral traditions of indigenous communities and has been documented by ethnobotanists. And what those ethnobotanists have found, repeatedly, is that traditional plant medicines frequently contain genuine pharmacological activity, genuine active compounds with real therapeutic effects, compounds that in many cases Western medicine spent decades or centuries rediscovering through formal research. The bark of the willow tree, which indigenous peoples in multiple parts of the world use to treat pain and fever, contains salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Quinine, the first effective antimalarial drug, was derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, which indigenous peoples of the Andes had been using to treat fever for centuries before Europeans encountered it. The list is long, and it represents only the portion of traditional pharmacological knowledge that survived into the post-contact era, that was documented before cultural disruption erased it, and that has so far been investigated by formal researchers. How much more was there? How many plant medicines? How many techniques for treating injury and illness? How many forms of knowledge about the healing properties of the natural world were encoded in oral traditions that didn't survive? We can't know. We can only register the magnitude of the possible loss and sit with the uncomfortable knowledge that some of the knowledge we lost might have changed medicine in ways we still haven't managed to change it. Consider navigational knowledge. The Polynesian peoples of the Pacific developed one of the most sophisticated navigational traditions in human history, capable of making deliberate, accurate crossings between islands separated by thousands of kilometers of featureless ocean, using techniques of star navigation, ocean swell reading, bird behavior interpretation, and cloud pattern analysis that allowed skilled navigators to determine their position and heading with a precision that amazed European sailors when they first encountered Polynesian voyagers. This knowledge was not simple. It required years of training to master, and it was transmitted through oral tradition, through story and song and the embodied practice of navigation itself. And it was developed and refined over the millennia of Polynesian expansion across the Pacific, a migration history that represents, in its own terms, one of the most extraordinary achievements in the 50,000 missing years. But Polynesian navigation, remarkable as it is, represents a tradition that survived long enough to be documented before it was substantially disrupted. How many other navigational traditions developed by seafaring peoples in other parts of the world, in Southeast Asia, in coastal Africa, along the coasts of the Americas, were lost without documentation? The people who first navigated to Australia had to have had some system for open ocean navigation. It was good enough to get them there. What was it? We don't know. The tradition that preserved it, if it was ever explicitly encoded as a transmissible tradition rather than implicit in the practice itself, didn't survive in a form we can access. Consider astronomical knowledge. People have been watching the sky systematically for at least as long as modern humans have existed. The ability to track celestial cycles, the movements of the sun and moon and planets, the rising and setting of particular stars at particular times of year, is not just intellectually interesting. It's practically useful in ways that would have been immediately obvious to people whose survival depended on knowing when to expect particular seasons, when animals were likely to be breeding, when certain plants would be at their most nutritious. There is evidence that people were tracking lunar cycles at least 30,000 years ago in the form of notched bones, whose patterns match lunar periodicity. There is evidence that some cosmological knowledge encoded in star lore may be extraordinarily ancient, predating the separation of populations that now share versions of the same stellar mythologies. And all of this represents knowledge that was developed, refined, maintained and encoded across the 50,000 missing years. Knowledge that served real purposes, solved real problems, saved real lives. Most of it is gone, not because it was wrong, not because it was superseded by something better, but because the cultural systems that held it were disrupted by colonization, by the violence of cultural displacement, by the simple fragility of oral tradition when the chain of transmission is broken. The 50,000 missing years don't end abruptly with a single moment of transformation. They end gradually, and then all at once, in the way that all long processes do, across the period of transition between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, between the Ice Age world and the warmer, more stable world we still inhabit today. And that transition, which played out over several thousand years, beginning around 15,000 years ago and largely complete by 10,000 years ago, was experienced by the people living through it, not as a historical transition that would be studied and named by scholars 10,000 years hence, but as the world simply being different from how it had been when they were children, and then different again, and then different once more. The ice sheets retreated. This was not a gentle or uniform process. There were rapid pulses of warming interspersed with dramatic cold reversals. There was the Younger Dryas, a sudden and severe return to near-glacial conditions that lasted for approximately 1,200 years, beginning around 12,900 years ago, interrupting what had appeared to be a steady warming trend and plunging populations that had begun adapting to warmer conditions back into cold and stress. The Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began, with a temperature shift of perhaps 10 degrees Celsius in Greenland occurring in a matter of decades. From the perspective of the people living through it, the climate was not slowly and gradually changing. It was lurching, sometimes violently, between states. The sea levels rose. Over the period of deglaciation, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters, a rise that was not smooth but episodic, with periods of rapid rise as ice sheets destabilized and large quantities of meltwater entered the oceans suddenly. In some coastal regions, the encroachment of the sea was gradual enough to be accommodated by migration inland over generations. In other regions, the sea may have advanced rapidly enough to be experienced as catastrophic by the people living on the coasts. The flooding of coastal plains that had been inhabited for thousands of years, the submersion of river valleys and estuaries, and productive coastal wetlands represents a loss of habitable territory and resource base that must have driven significant human movement and, in some cases, crisis. And the megafauna died. This is one of the most significant and most debated events of the late Pleistocene, and the debate about its causes illuminates something important about the relationship between humans and the world in the 50,000 missing years. Across the world in the period between roughly 50,000 years ago and roughly 10,000 years ago, the large animals, the megafauna, went extinct. The pattern was not random. It was correlated with varying lags and regional variations, with the arrival of modern humans in each region. Australia lost most of its megafauna within a few thousand years of human arrival, 50,000 years ago. North and South America lost between 70 and 80% of their megafaunal genera within a few thousand years of human arrival, roughly 13,000 years ago. In Africa and parts of Asia, where humans and megafauna had co-evolved over a longer period, the extinctions were less dramatic, possibly because the animals had had time to develop appropriate fear of human hunters. The debate is between those who attribute the extinctions primarily to human hunting, the overkill hypothesis, and those who attribute them primarily to climate change at the end of the Ice Age, with various intermediate positions arguing for combinations of both. The current evidence suggests that in most cases, the answer is neither alone, but some combination. Climate change creating stress on megafaunal populations, human hunting exploiting that stress, and in many cases pushing already reduced populations over the edge into extinction. The relative weighting of climate and hunting varied by region, by species, and by the specific circumstances of each extinction event. What matters for our story here is what the loss of the megafauna meant for the people who had lived alongside them. Because for 50,000 years in many parts of the world, the large animals had been central to human life in a way that is difficult to overstate. They were food, obviously, but they were also more than food. They were neighbors. They were presences in the landscape that shaped how people moved, where people went, how people understood the world. They were the subject of art, repeated endlessly on cave walls across the world, in images of extraordinary care and attention. They were, almost certainly, characters in the stories and the mythologies that gave meaning to human existence. And then they were gone. There is one aspect of the 50,000 missing years that deserves its own careful attention, because it represents a kind of loss so complete and so permanent that even the grief for it requires a special quality of imagination. The languages. not language in the abstract, the capacity for human speech, which survives and flourishes in every human population alive today. But the specific languages, the thousands upon thousands of individual languages that were spoken and thought in and dreamed in and argued in and sung in across those 50,000 years. The languages in which the first humans to see Australia described what they saw. The language in which the person who painted the horses at Chauvet thought about what they were doing. The languages in which the survivors of the Toba winter tried to explain to their children what had happened and why the world was so changed. All of them. Gone. Every single one. How many languages were spoken in 50,000 years of fully modern human life? There is no way to know, but we can get some sense of the scale. Today, with a global human population of 8 billion people connected by centuries of trade, conquest, colonization, and communication, there are approximately 7,000 languages still spoken in the world. Many of them are endangered, spoken by only a few hundred people, maintained by communities whose children are being pulled toward larger, more economically powerful languages. Linguists estimate that roughly half of the world's current 7,000 languages will be extinct by the end of this century. And the 7,000 languages alive today are themselves the survivors of thousands of years of language death and replacement, the remnants of a once far greater diversity. During the 50,000 missing years when human populations were smaller, more geographically isolated, and less connected to each other by trade and travel, linguistic diversity would have been far greater than it is today. Small populations separated by geography, with limited contact with other groups, naturally develop linguistic divergence over time, as each group's language evolves independently, accumulating changes that eventually make mutual comprehension impossible. The rate of language divergence is not precisely known and varies considerably by circumstance, but it is well established that languages change and split and grow apart over time, the way biological lineages do. 50,000 years of human life in small, isolated groups across the entire globe would have produced linguistic diversity of extraordinary scale. Most of those languages are gone without a trace. Not just undocumented, not just unrecorded, but gone in the most complete sense. No speakers, no written records, no documentation of any kind. Not even the borrowed words that often survive in neighboring languages when a language dies slowly. The languages that were spoken by the people of the 50,000 missing years are gone the way the animals are gone, the way the forests are gone completely and permanently. We don't know what sounds they used. We don't know what grammatical categories they organized the world into. We don't know whether they had words for things we have no words for, whether they carved up the spectrum of human experience in ways that revealed aspects of it that our current languages obscure, whether the categories their grammars imposed on the world let their speakers perceive connections and distinctions that our languages don't make available. The question of what language does to thought, how the specific structure of a language shapes or enables or constrains the thinking of the people who use it, is one of the most fascinating and most contested in cognitive science. In its strong form, the hypothesis that language determines thought, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, is generally regarded as too strong. You can have thoughts that your language doesn't have ready words for, and you can think certain things across language barriers in ways that would be impossible if language fully determined thought. But in weaker, more nuanced forms, the evidence that language influences thought, that the categories your language makes available to you affect what you habitually notice and how you organize your perceptions, is increasingly strong. If that's true, then the 50,000 languages of the missing years contained 50,000 different ways of being in the world. 50,000 different grammars of human experience. Some of them probably organize time differently from the ways our current languages do, marking tense and aspect in ways that foregrounded or backgrounded different aspects of temporal experience. Some probably had richer vocabularies for certain areas of experience: the natural world, the social world, the emotional. Disclaimer: this video contains fictional and / or AI-assisted elements created for artistic and entertainment purposes. It does not aim to mislead viewers or present real-world events as factual documentation that reflected the particular knowledge and preoccupations of the communities that spoke them. Some probably had grammatical structures that required speakers to specify things that our languages leave optional, or left optional things that ours require. Each of these differences was a different angle on the same reality, a different way of carving the world into categories, a different way of making experience speakable and therefore shareable. All of those angles are gone. We're left with the angles that survived, the languages alive today, and the historical languages that were documented before they died. This is not nothing. 7,000 languages and the historical record represent an extraordinary range of human linguistic creativity. But it is, in the context of 50,000 years of linguistic diversity, a small sample. And the samples we've lost are precisely the oldest, the most different from any language spoken today, the languages that evolved in the most isolation from each other and from the linguistic traditions that eventually produced the world's current languages. We've been talking about art and knowledge and migration and survival, about the practical and the technical and the intellectual. But there's a dimension of the 50,000 missing years that we've been circling without quite landing on, and it's possibly the most important dimension for understanding what those people were actually like. Their spiritual life, their religious imagination, their relationship to whatever they understood as the sacred. Every human culture we have ever documented, without exception, has had some form of religious or spiritual belief and practice. This is not an accident of history or a product of any particular stage of social complexity. It is a human universal, as consistent across cultures as language itself, as consistent as kinship systems and music and the use of fire. The anthropologist Pascal Boyer and others have argued that religious cognition is not a cultural add-on to an otherwise secular human nature, but an expression of specific cognitive tendencies, the tendency to detect agency in ambiguous phenomena, the tendency to think in terms of intentional beings, the tendency to seek meaning in pattern, that are themselves products of the cognitive architecture that makes human intelligence possible. The cognitive tendencies that make us good at understanding other minds, at predicting behavior, at reading social situations, are the same tendencies that generate the religious imagination. They are not separable. Religion is not a mistake that reason eventually corrects. It is an expression of the same intelligence that does everything else. If this is right, then the people of the 50,000 missing years had rich, complex, fully developed religious or spiritual lives. Not primitive superstition gradually being replaced by more sophisticated understanding. Not fumbling in the dark toward the eventual light of agricultural civilization's more organized religions. Rich, developed, sophisticated inner lives organized around whatever they understood as the sacred, expressed in whatever ceremonies and symbols and art forms their cultures had developed, sustained by whatever cosmological stories their traditions had accumulated across generations. We can see evidence of this in the archaeological record. Not everywhere and not in full detail, because spiritual life tends to be expressed in organic materials and performed behaviors that don't survive the archaeological record. But enough. The careful placement of a cave bear skull on a stone in Chauvet Cave is either a completely random arrangement of elements that happens to look deliberate to modern eyes, or it's evidence of intentional ritual action, a ceremony involving bear skulls whose meaning we cannot recover, but whose intentionality is hard to dismiss. The red ochre used in burials, sometimes covering the bones of the dead so thoroughly that the skeleton is stained red, is almost universally interpreted as evidence of ritual treatment of the dead, of belief in some form that made the careful preparation of a dead person's body meaningful rather than pointlessly effortful. The grave goods, the animal bones and tools and ornaments placed with the dead, represent belief in something, a journey, an afterlife, the possibility that the dead would need these things wherever they were going. And the art, the extraordinary, consistent, geographically widespread tradition of making images in caves, of going deep into the earth to paint animals and hands and abstract symbols in places that required effort and risk to reach, places where no one lived, places that could only be visited by firelight, suggests a spiritual geography of the underground that we find, in various forms, in cultures around the world. The earth below as the realm of the dead. The depths of caves as places of communication between the world of the living and the world of whatever lies beyond it. Whether the specific beliefs of the Chauvet painters or the Lascaux painters about what lay beyond death were in any way continuous with the beliefs of later cultures in the same region, we cannot know. But the practice of making the cave a sacred space, a space set apart from ordinary habitation and devoted to something beyond the practical needs of daily survival, is unmistakable. The people of the 50,000 missing years were not secular. They were not waiting for religion to be invented. They were already, fully, completely engaged with whatever they understood as the sacred, in ways that we cannot fully reconstruct, but that clearly shaped their lives and their deaths, and the art they left behind, as the most durable expression of interior lives that were rich beyond our ability to fully measure. Agriculture didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from the 50,000 years of knowledge that preceded it, from people who already knew the plants around them with an intimacy that's difficult for us to imagine, who already understood the seasonality of food sources and the logic of resource management, who had, in some cases, been deliberately managing landscapes for thousands of years through burning and selective harvesting, before anyone thought to put seeds deliberately in the ground. The transition to agriculture was not a single event. It happened multiple times, independently, in different parts of the world, beginning at different times, involving different crops and different animals. The Fertile Crescent beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, with wheat and barley and goats and sheep. China beginning roughly 9,000 years ago, with rice in the south and millet in the north. Mesoamerica beginning roughly 10,000 years ago, with maize and squash and beans. West Africa independently. The highlands of New Guinea independently. Eastern North America independently. Each transition represents the convergence of local ecological opportunity and accumulated human knowledge on the same basic solution to the same basic problem. How to produce more food, more reliably, to support a larger and more settled population. And each transition involved a trade. Because agriculture in its early forms was in many ways harder on the people practicing it than the hunter-gatherer lifestyle it was replacing, at least in the short term. The evidence from human skeletons tells this story with uncomfortable clarity. Early agricultural populations, compared to the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded or surrounded them, show dramatically increased rates of dental caries, because the high carbohydrate diets based on cultivated grains promoted tooth decay in ways that the diverse diets of foragers did not. They show increased evidence of nutritional deficiencies, including the bone lesions associated with anemia and the skeletal markers of chronic malnutrition, because early agriculture typically narrowed the diet to a smaller number of staple crops and eliminated the extraordinary nutritional diversity that hunter-gatherers maintained by exploiting dozens or hundreds of different food sources across different seasons. They show increased evidence of chronic repetitive strain injuries from the labor of farming, from grinding grain and carrying water and hoeing fields. They show, in many cases, smaller bodies and reduced stature, a physiological indicator of chronic nutritional stress. The first farmers, by many measurable metrics, had harder lives than the last hunter-gatherers. And yet, the transition happened. And once it happened in a region, it spread, because farming supported higher population densities, and the sheer numbers of agricultural populations eventually overwhelmed or displaced foraging populations wherever the two came into sustained contact. The logic of agriculture was not that it was better for the individual people practicing it. It was that it was better for the collective survival and expansion of the population as a whole. More people could live on the same land. The population grew. The population growth justified the harder work of farming, and eventually, through the sheer arithmetic of numbers, the farming populations came to dominate the landscape. But in the process, something was lost, and the people who lived through the transition, who remembered the other way, must have known it was lost: the freedom to move, the intimate knowledge of wild places, the relationship with the natural world built on participation rather than management, the extraordinary diversity of the hunter-gatherer diet and the encyclopedic ecological knowledge required to maintain it, the specific quality of attention, that total, embodied life-depending awareness of the living world around you, that was both the product and the requirement of forager life. None of this should be romanticized. Hunter-gatherer life was hard in ways that we, from the cushioned distance of modern industrial comfort, are ill-equipped to appreciate. Child mortality was high. The consequences of a bad season could be lethal in ways that they simply aren't for people embedded in agricultural and industrial food systems. The freedom to move could, in cold or drought years, become the obligation to move when you didn't want to, when you were sick or old or there were young children who struggled with distance. There was no freedom from the consequences of ecological failure. If the game didn't come or the plants didn't fruit, you went hungry in a way that most of us today will never experience. But the gains of agriculture came at costs, and those costs included the loss of most of the knowledge, most of the practice, most of the lived experience of the 50,000 years that came before. The transition to agriculture and then to writing was not a simple upgrade from a worse system to a better one. It was a trade with genuine losses and genuine gains on both sides. And part of what was lost, irretrievably, was most of what the 50,000 missing years had been. One of the things we most frequently get wrong about the 50,000 missing years, even when we've corrected the error of thinking the people were primitive, is the nature of their social lives. There's a residual tendency to imagine hunter-gatherer existence as solitary, or at best, small-scale. Isolated family groups barely in contact with neighboring groups, each struggling alone against the vast, indifferent landscape. But the archaeological evidence, the genetic evidence, and the comparative evidence from hunter-gatherer societies that survived long enough to be studied all point to something far more complex, far more socially rich, and far more connected than this picture suggests. Hunter-gatherer societies were not simple. Their economies were not simple. Their social structures were not simple. They operated with what anthropologists call complex reciprocity, elaborate systems of exchange, obligation, gift-giving, and mutual aid that connected individuals, families, and groups across long distances and over long periods of time. These systems were the social technology that made survival possible in environments where resources were unevenly distributed and unpredictably variable. A family that had a good hunting season shared generously, not out of altruism in the abstract, but out of the practical understanding that when their season was bad, they would need the same generosity from others. The social network was the insurance system. The strength and reliability of your relationships was your buffer against catastrophe. You couldn't store enough food to survive a bad year, but you could invest enough in your relationships that other people would help you through one. This creates social structures of considerable complexity and considerable moral weight. The obligations of reciprocity had to be tracked and honored across long time periods and across the complexity of changing circumstances. The negotiations of who owed what to whom, the management of conflicts arising from perceived violations of reciprocity, the diplomacy required to maintain relationships with neighboring groups who were sometimes potential allies and sometimes potential competitors. All of this required sophisticated social intelligence of a kind that would be immediately recognizable if we encountered it in a contemporary setting. The evidence from ancient genetics is particularly striking on this point. When researchers analyze the genetic structure of ancient populations from the Paleolithic period, they consistently find evidence of substantial gene flow between groups. Ancient hunter-gatherer populations were not isolated. They were exchanging mates, and therefore genes, across distances that imply regular contact and deliberate maintenance of social connections between groups. This is exactly what we'd expect from complex reciprocity systems, the marriage networks that connected groups, sending young women or men between communities according to rules, and negotiations of considerable social complexity were also the conduits of genetic exchange. The genetic evidence is, in this sense, an indirect record of the social networks that existed in the 50,000 missing years. It's the shadow of all those relationships, all those negotiations, all those ceremonies of union between families and groups, preserved in the base pairs of living people's DNA long after every other trace of those relationships has dissolved. And those networks extended further than we might expect. Archaeologists have found evidence of raw materials transported long distances from their geological sources. Obsidian from volcanic sources in central Turkey appears at sites throughout the Levant and into the Nile Valley, implying exchange networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Shell ornaments from coastal sources appear at sites deep inland. Ochre of specific geological types appears at sites far from the nearest sources of that particular ochre. These are not accidental distributions. They're the residue of deliberate exchange, of people moving materials across long distances either directly by traveling or indirectly through chains of exchange that passed materials from group to group across hundreds of kilometers. These exchange networks were the ancient postal system, the long-distance communication network that allowed knowledge and technology and material goods and, presumably, ideas and stories and people to circulate across the landscape in ways that prevented any local group from being entirely isolated. Social complexity also manifested in what we might cautiously call politics. The management of relationships within and between groups, the maintenance of norms and the handling of norm violations, the negotiation of who had authority in which situations and over which domains. These are not activities that spontaneously generate themselves only in settled societies with writing and formal institutions. They are activities that human beings engage in wherever there are more than a very few people in sustained contact with each other. The specific forms they took in the 50,000 missing years, we cannot recover in detail. But the cognitive architecture that makes these activities possible, the social intelligence, the theory of mind, the ability to model multiple other people's beliefs and intentions and relationships simultaneously, the sensitivity to hierarchy and reciprocity and fairness. This architecture is as old as modern human cognition. It was present in those people as fully as it is in us. They were political beings. They were social beings of extraordinary sophistication. And the social worlds they built, invisible to us now, were probably as rich in drama and complexity and moral weight as the social worlds we build today. Of all the evidence that the people of the 50,000 missing years had inner lives as rich and as human as our own, perhaps nothing is more immediately affecting than the musical instruments. Not the ochre engravings, impressive as they are, not the cave paintings, extraordinary as they are, but the small, carefully made objects found at archaeological sites across Europe and Asia, flutes carved from bone and ivory, instruments that required significant skill to make and that were clearly capable of producing real music, real melody, real emotional expression, and that were made by people who valued music enough to invest that skill and that effort. The oldest confirmed musical instruments in the world were found at sites in southern Germany, in the Swabian Jura region that was clearly a center of extraordinary cultural richness 40,000 years ago. Among the finds from Vogelherd, Hohlefels, and Geissenklösterler caves are flutes carved from bird bone, specifically vulture and swan wing bones selected for their appropriate tube diameter and the quality of the material for producing clear tones. Alongside these are flutes carved from mammoth ivory, a considerably more demanding material that required splitting and shaping and joining and sealing, evidence of a substantial investment of time and skill. The flutes are perforated with finger holes, positioned in ways that indicate deliberate musical construction, not accidental perforation or use for some other purpose. They were made to be played. They were made to produce specific notes, specific intervals, specific possibilities for melody. The vulture bone flute found at Hohlefels is a 5-hole instrument capable of playing notes across a substantial musical range. It is, by any reasonable assessment, capable of producing music of genuine melodic and harmonic complexity. Not the primitive noise of someone banging rocks together, not the limited range of the simplest noise-making device. Real music, structured, intentional, capable of carrying melody and expressing the emotional content that melody can carry across the silence of 40,000 years into your chest. And music, we know from every human culture that has ever been studied, is not just entertainment. It is social technology. It creates and maintains group cohesion in ways that go deeper than verbal communication, activating the synchronization between people that comes from shared rhythmic experience, the literal physical alignment of heartbeats and breathing, and motor patterns that happens when people make music together or move together to music. It marks and reinforces the significant transitions of life, the ceremonies of birth and coming of age and coupling and death that every culture performs. It transmits knowledge in forms that are easier to remember than plain speech, because the rhythmic and melodic structure of song provides a memory framework that plain prose doesn't. And it expresses the emotional life of a community in forms that can be shared collectively, giving shape to feelings that might otherwise remain inchoate and isolating. The people who played those Ice Age flutes were doing all of these things. The music is gone. But the instruments are here, and they tell us in their small and carved and precise way that 40,000 years ago, people made music, that it mattered, and that whatever they felt when they played it was real and deep and specifically human in ways that should never be underestimated. Every year, the 50,000 missing years become slightly less missing, The progress is not dramatic. There is no single discovery that will resolve the remaining mysteries in a single revelation. But the accumulation of findings across the fields of archaeology, genetics, paleoclimatology, and linguistics is slowly and persistently changing the picture. And the picture that's emerging is one of greater complexity, greater sophistication, and greater antiquity to human cognitive and cultural capability than the older story was able to accommodate. Ancient DNA analysis is perhaps the fastest moving field right now, and its findings have been consistently surprising in the direction of greater complexity. The discovery of the Denisovans from 3 bone fragments in a Siberian cave demonstrated that unknown human populations could be discovered through genetics alone, without any significant material culture record. Subsequent work has suggested that Denisovan populations were more geographically widespread and genetically diverse than those 3 bones from a single cave would imply, with at least 2 genetically distinct Denisovan groups whose ranges may have extended from Siberia to Southeast Asia. Work published in 2019 reported the discovery of an individual found in the same Denisova cave, who was the child of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father, direct evidence of interbreeding between the 2 archaic populations. The cave was clearly a place where different human lineages encountered each other over a very long period, making it one of the most extraordinary sites in the entire history of human evolution research. Genetic analysis of living populations continues to yield surprises. Studies of population structure and migration history in ancient DNA from archaeological sites around the world are revealing migration patterns and population replacements that were entirely unknown until the last decade. The genetic history of Europe, for instance, turns out to be a story of at least 3 major population replacements over the last 40,000 years, as hunter-gatherer populations were replaced or substantially diluted by waves of migrants, first from Anatolia bringing agriculture roughly 9,000 years ago, and then from the Eurasian steppe roughly 5,000 years ago. The hunter-gatherers who made the cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet are not the genetic ancestors of most modern Europeans. Their descendants were largely replaced, their genetic contribution to modern European populations relatively small. The people who made the cave art are, in a genetic sense, mostly gone, though their biological legacy survives in some proportion in living people, as ghost signals in the ancestry analysis. Archaeological findings in the Americas are rewriting the timeline of human occupation there. The question of when people first arrived in the Americas has been one of the most contentious in paleoanthropology, with the traditional Clovis first model, which placed the first Americans around 13,000 years ago crossing from Beringia, being progressively challenged by evidence of earlier occupation at multiple sites. The Monteverde site in Chile, with secure dates of 14,500 years ago, established that people were deep in South America before the commonly accepted Clovis dates for North America, implying either a pre-Clovis population or a coastal migration route that bypassed the glacial barriers that supposedly prevented entry via the traditional land route. Recent work at sites in North America, including Chiquihuit Cave in Mexico and the Cerruti Mastodon site in California, suggests the possibility of human presence in the Americas as far back as 30,000 years ago, a claim that remains contested but that is being taken seriously by serious researchers in ways it would not have been 20 years ago. The cave art continues to be found and dated, and the dates continue to push back. The discovery in 2019 of the Leang Bulu Sipong narrative scene in Sulawesi, dated to more than 45,000 years ago, moved the oldest narrative art in the world from Europe to Southeast Asia, and implied that the tradition of making complex figurative art was present in human populations across a very wide area from very early in the period we're discussing. Subsequent work in the same region has found more examples, and ongoing surveys in cave systems that have never been systematically investigated are likely to produce more findings that extend the known history of figurative art. What all of this means taken together is that the 50,000 missing years are becoming progressively less silent. Not all at once. Not through a single dramatic revelation that resolves the mystery, but through the accumulation of findings that together compose an increasingly detailed, increasingly complex, increasingly human picture of the world before writing. The picture that's emerging is not of primitive people stumbling towards civilization. It's of fully human beings, with all the cognitive richness and cultural complexity that entails navigating a world of extraordinary challenge and occasional catastrophe with intelligence, adaptability, and the specifically human insistence on making meaning from experience. There is a particular kind of wondering that the 50,000 missing years invites. And it's the wondering about what those people thought the world was. Not what they knew about it in the practical survival sense, not the ecological and navigational knowledge we've been discussing, but what they believed about its fundamental nature. What they understood themselves to be in relation to it. What they thought was behind it. What they thought it meant. Every human culture we have ever studied has had a cosmology. A story about the nature and origin of the world, about the relationship between human beings and the non-human powers and presences they perceived around them, about what death was and where the dead went, and whether there was any continuity between the living and the dead. These cosmologies vary enormously in their specific content, in the specific beings they populate the world with, and the specific narratives they use to explain its origin and structure. But they share certain deep structural features across all cultures, features that seem to reflect the universal features of human cognition applied to the universal experience of being a small, conscious, mortal creature in an enormous and often terrifying and sometimes beautiful world. The world is animated. This is perhaps the most consistently cross-cultural feature of pre-scientific cosmology. The sense that the world is populated by intentional beings, that the forces and phenomena of the natural world are not merely physical, but are in some sense minded, intentional, capable of response to human action and appeal. This doesn't necessarily mean that every culture believed in a single god or even in gods as conventionally understood, but it almost always means that the world was experienced as inhabited by agency at multiple levels, in animals, in plants, in rivers and mountains and weather systems, in the forces of astronomical cycles, in the spirits of ancestors and the dead. The world was not a collection of inert physical processes happening indifferently. It was a community of beings, some of them comprehensible and some of them mysterious and some of them dangerous, with which human beings stood in relationships of obligation and reciprocity, not entirely unlike their relationships with other humans. This perspective, which anthropologists have sometimes called animism, is not a primitive misunderstanding of how the physical world works. It is a particular way of being in relationship with the world, a way that takes seriously the aliveness and agency and significance of non-human beings and processes, that maintains human embeddedness in the larger community of life, rather than treating human beings as separate from and superior to that community. Whatever its specific metaphysical truth value, it generates a particular quality of attention to the world, a kind of listening and responsiveness that the purely mechanistic modern view often doesn't, and it generates a particular quality of ethical relationship to the non-human world that places obligations on human behavior that purely utilitarian frameworks don't. The people of the 50,000 missing years lived inside cosmologies of this general character. We can't know the specifics. We can't know the specific beings they perceived in the landscape, the specific stories they told about the relationship between humans and non-humans, the specific ceremonies they performed to maintain the balance and reciprocity that their cosmologies required. But we can know the broad shape of what they believed, because the cognitive tendencies that generate these kinds of beliefs are universal, and because the archaeological evidence, the ritual treatment of animals, the sacred use of caves, the grave goods, the ochre, points consistently toward a world experienced as spiritually inhabited rather than physically indifferent. And those cosmologies mattered. They were not merely intellectual frameworks, not just theoretical positions about the nature of reality that could be held at arm's length from daily life. They were lived understandings that shaped every action, every relationship, every encounter with the natural world. The hunter who approached a prey animal in a landscape animated by intentional beings approached that animal differently from a hunter in a disenchanted mechanical world. The relationship was different. The ceremony before and after the kill was different. The understanding of what it meant to take a life and what was owed in return was different. The cosmology was the water those people swam in, the invisible medium of their experience, the framework that made their experience intelligible to them and to each other. All of those cosmologies are gone in their specific form. What remains are fragments, hints, traces, the art, the burials, the ochre, the positioning of bones, and the shadows of those old cosmologies in the mythological traditions that survived into the historical period changed almost beyond recognition, but retaining certain structural features that point back towards something older, something that shaped the thinking of people 50,000 years before those traditions were first written down. The 50,000 missing years left records in places we sometimes forget to look, not just in the caves and the sediment layers and the ancient DNA in us, in our bodies, in the ways our bodies work and the ways they fail, in the shapes of our fears and desires and cognitive tendencies, in the architecture of our nervous systems that was shaped by the specific demands of the world those people lived in. The human fear response, the specific pattern of physiological changes that occur when you perceive danger, the quickening pulse, the sharpened attention, the narrowing of focus onto the threatening stimulus. This response was tuned by 50,000 years of predator-prey relationships and social threat. The specific things that trigger fear in humans, loud, sudden noises, fast movement in peripheral vision, certain kinds of darkness, certain kinds of social rejection, these reflect the specific threats that the ancestral environment presented. Not the abstract threats of the modern world, not the diffuse, statistical, invisible threats of climate change or economic insecurity or chronic stress, but the immediate, specific, physical threats of a world with predators and rivals, and the constant possibility of sudden violence. We live with these ancient fear responses in bodies evolved for a world that most of us no longer inhabit. The startle response that makes you jump at a sudden sound was calibrated for a world where sudden sounds often meant predators. The social anxiety that makes public speaking more feared by many people than death reflects the ancestral importance of social acceptance, where social rejection in a small, interdependent community genuinely could be life-threatening. The tendency to lie awake at night, rehearsing potential disasters, which mental health professionals recognize as a common form of anxiety, was probably adaptive in a world where planning for potential threats had real survival value, where the person who worried about whether the river crossing was safe enough was more likely to survive than the person who didn't think about it. Understanding the ancestral origins of our bodies and our psychology doesn't make modern life easier, necessarily, but it does change the shape of self-understanding. Your anxiety is not a malfunction. It's a tuned instrument playing music written for a different concert hall. Your love of fire, the specific quality of ease and safety and warmth that a campfire produces even in people who live in thoroughly climate-controlled modern environments, that's a response calibrated by hundreds of thousands of years in which fire was the central technology of survival and social life. Your need for story, for narrative, for the particular satisfaction of a plot that resolves itself, that's a cognitive adaptation shaped by 50,000 years of oral tradition in which story was the primary technology for transmitting knowledge across generations. Your children's need for stories at bedtime, your own need for the particular quality of darkness and quiet that makes sleep possible, the specific comfort of being in a small, enclosed space with familiar faces during a storm, the specific pleasure of gathering with people you love around a shared meal and shared light. These are not arbitrary cultural habits. They're expressions of biological architecture shaped across the 50,000 missing years and before. The things that feel like home to you, the sensory configurations that signal safety and belonging at a level below conscious thought, those signals were calibrated in the world before agriculture, in the world before cities, in the world before writing. They're the voices of the 50,000 missing years, speaking in your body every day. It would be easy and perhaps tempting to treat the 50,000 missing years as historically interesting but ultimately irrelevant to any practical concern of the present. Ancient people doing ancient things in ancient landscapes. Fascinating as a puzzle, perhaps, as a detective story of deep time, but without obvious implications for how we live now or how we might live better. But I think that's wrong. I think the 50,000 missing years matter now, specifically now in ways that are becoming clearer as our own civilization faces challenges that lack easy precedents in recorded history. And I think the reason they matter is precisely that they're the part of the human story that our usual frameworks, our usual sources of historical wisdom, don't have access to. The part of the story that wasn't written down. The part that was lived in ways that left different traces. Consider resilience. The populations that survived the Toba eruption, if the bottleneck hypothesis is correct even partially, survived in part because their distribution across diverse environments provided redundancy when any single environment failed. The populations that survived the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions survived by diversifying their food sources, broadening their diets, developing new relationships with smaller, faster prey as the large animals disappeared. The populations that survived the dramatic climate swings of the Ice Age survived by maintaining cultural flexibility, by not being so committed to a single strategy that a shift in environmental conditions left them without options. These are the principles underlying resilience in complex systems in any era. Distribution, redundancy, flexibility, the willingness to change strategy when the environment changes. They were being applied at a species level for 50,000 years before any of us were born. We are the descendants of the people who survived all of those things. Every person alive today is the end of a line of descent that traces back through 50,000 years of catastrophe and recovery, through volcanic winters and glacial maximums and megafaunal extinctions and sea level rises, and the encounters with other human species, and the open ocean crossings, and the migrations across continents into unknown environments. Every person alive is descended from survivors, not from the lucky or the privileged, but from people who found ways through things that killed enormous numbers of their contemporaries. That inheritance is real, even if it's difficult to quantify. And the knowledge of it, the sense of what our species has already navigated, should inform how we think about the challenges we face now. Consider our relationship to the natural world. The people of the 50,000 missing years lived in ecological intimacy with their environments that is, for most people in industrialized societies today, essentially inconceivable. They were not nature lovers in the romantic tourist sense. They were participants in ecosystems in ways that required constant, detailed, embodied knowledge of the living world. Where water was, what was edible and what was poisonous, how to read animal behavior to anticipate movement and vulnerability, how to predict weather from sky and wind and the behavior of birds, how the landscape changed across seasons in ways that required shifting strategies. This knowledge was not abstract. It was survival. It was the product of a relationship to the natural world so attentive that we struggle to imagine it from within our insulated, climate-controlled, food-abundant present. The ecological crisis we face now is partly a crisis of that relationship, of a species that evolved to be intimately connected to the living systems of the planet, finding itself, through the extraordinary success of its own civilization, increasingly alienated from those systems and increasingly without the knowledge required to understand the consequences of what it's doing to them. The reconnection we need is not nostalgic or regressive. We cannot and should not try to return to a hunter-gatherer existence. But understanding what that relationship was, understanding what we lost when we exchanged it for the comforts and capabilities of industrial civilization, might help us make better choices about what we keep and what we sacrifice as we try to navigate the ecological challenges of the present. Consider also what the 50,000 missing years tell us about the nature of human capacity itself. The story of civilization, as usually told, is a story of continuous progress, of human capability improving steadily as accumulated knowledge enabled more sophisticated technology and more complex social organization. In this story, the people who came before are necessarily less capable than the people who came after, because capability is defined as technical and material sophistication, and technical and material sophistication is defined as what we have now. But the 50,000 missing years tell a different story. A story of people with identical cognitive capacity to our own, who were doing extraordinary things, with the knowledge and materials available to them, things that we have systematically underestimated, because our metrics for sophistication are built around the kinds of sophistication that leave physical traces in the archaeological record. The first person to cross the open ocean to Australia was not less intelligent than the engineers who designed the GPS navigation system. They were differently knowledgeable with different tools, operating in a different information environment. But the cognitive act of deciding to cross an ocean with no guarantee of what lay on the other side, of committing to that decision and preparing for it and executing it, that required everything we recognize as human. Courage, imagination, the ability to hold a hypothetical future in mind and work backwards from it to present actions. The ability to manage fear and uncertainty in service of a goal. The ability to cooperate with others under stress. All of it, 50,000 years ago. Among all the evidence from the 50,000 missing years, perhaps the most humanizing, the most quietly devastating in its implications, is the evidence of how those people treated their dead. Because in the way a culture treats its dead, you see most clearly what it believes about what a person is. Whether a person's significance ends with their last breath, or whether something of them continues that deserves acknowledgement and care and ceremony. And every culture we've ever found evidence of however ancient, however far removed from anything we'd call organized religion, treated its dead with something. The oldest clear evidence of intentional burial by modern humans is from sites in Africa and the Middle East, dating back roughly 100,000 years. At Kafsa Cave in Israel, the remains of at least 15 individuals were found in what appear to be deliberate burials, some of them accompanied by animal bones and ochre. At Border Cave in South Africa, an infant was buried with a perforated shell ornament, perhaps a personal possession or a gift from a parent, an object placed with care into the ground alongside a small body. These are not casual disposals of the dead. They are ceremonies, however simple, however unelaborated compared to the funerary traditions of later cultures. They are evidence of people who understood that a dead person had been a person, and that this fact deserved recognition in a form beyond mere biological disposal. The Neanderthals, for all the debate about the specifics of their burial practices, also appear to have treated their dead with care. The site of La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, where the skeleton of an elderly Neanderthal man was found in a position suggesting intentional burial, remains one of the most discussed finds in the entire history of paleoanthropology. The man had severe arthritis and had lost most of his teeth, which means he would have been largely dependent on others for food in the years before his death. That he lived so long in that condition is itself evidence of care, of a community that supported its dependent members. Whether this constitutes compassion in the full moral sense we intend by that word is a question that touches on deep issues about the nature of Neanderthal consciousness and social organization. But the behavioral evidence for support of the dependent and care of the dead is real, and it's recognizable as something that belongs on the same continuum as our own practices. By the time we reach the cultural explosion of the Upper Paleolithic, 40,000 years ago, the treatment of the dead had become elaborate in ways that leave unmistakable evidence. The burial known as Sunghir, found near the city of Vladimir in Russia and dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, is one of the most extraordinary finds in the entire archaeological record of this period. A man of approximately 60 years old, which was a considerable age for the period, was buried with an extraordinary abundance of material goods, almost 3,000 ivory beads that had been sewn onto his clothing or laid around his body, dozens of fox teeth, carved ivory pendants, a carved ivory figurine. The making of those 3,000 ivory beads alone, each one individually perforated and smoothed, would have required an estimated 10,000 hours of labor. Someone, a whole community, invested that labor in preparing this man for death. And buried alongside him were two children, a girl and a boy estimated at roughly 10 and 13 years of age, placed head to head in the same grave, each adorned with their own extraordinary abundance of grave goods, including their own ivory beads, carved ivory lances, carved animal figurines, fox teeth, and a piece of human leg bone filled with red ochre. The children's burials are, in their own way, more affecting than the adults. The care invested in their preparation, the specific objects placed with them, the arrangement of the bodies, all of it speaks of grief, specific, personal, devastating grief, and of whatever beliefs about the afterlife or the continuation of the person that made these preparations meaningful. These people were not certain about what death was. They were hoping. They were doing everything they could to ensure that whoever or whatever those children still were, wherever they had gone or were going, they would be equipped for it. 34,000 years separate us from those burials. But the grief is not alien. The grief is not primitive. The grief is ours, recognizably, completely, in all its specific humanness. The parent or grandparent or community elder who arranged those children's bodies, who placed the carved figurines beside their hands, who covered them with ochre and beads and the specific objects that mattered to them in life. That person was doing something we recognize, not just intellectually, as an anthropological observation. In our bodies, in the part of us that knows, without being told, what grief looks like and what it costs. Philosophy, in its formal, institutional sense, has a history of about 2,500 years, beginning with the pre-Socratics of ancient Greece and their contemporaries in India and China in the axial age of the first millennium BCE. Written philosophy, systematic and argued and preserved for transmission, has that history. But the questions that philosophy asks, the questions that are the reason philosophy exists, are not 2,500 years old. They are as old as the specifically human form of consciousness. They are as old as any human mind that was complex enough to notice its own existence and find that noticing disorienting. What am I? What is this world I find myself in? What happens when I die? Why is there something rather than nothing? What do I owe to others, and what do they owe to me? How should I live? What is beauty, and why does it move me? What is the source of the feeling that some things matter and others don't? These questions don't require a university or a philosophical tradition or a written language to arise. They require only the kind of mind that modern humans have had for at least 60,000 years. And a mind capable of asking them will ask them, because they are the questions that the specifically human form of consciousness inevitably generates. The people of the 50,000 missing years were philosophers, not systematic philosophers in the institutional sense, but people who asked the questions, who formulated provisional answers, who argued about those answers around fires, and in the preparation of ceremonies, and in the teaching of children, who refined their understanding across generations in the absence of writing by maintaining the questions and the best current answers in story and ceremony and practice. Their philosophy is gone. We don't have the arguments. We don't have the positions. We don't have the specific answers they arrived at, or the specific grounds on which they contested each other's positions. But we have the evidence of the questions being taken seriously. We have the burials, which are philosophical statements about the nature of death and what follows it. We have the cave art, which is a philosophical statement about the relationship between human beings and the non-human world, about what is worth representing and why representation matters. We have the instruments, which are a philosophical statement about the significance of beauty and the validity of the specifically human response to it. We have the long-distance exchange networks, which are philosophical statements about the obligations of reciprocity and the value of connection across difference. And we have the specific artifact that haunts me the most, the one I keep coming back to when I try to find the clearest evidence that the philosophical questions were alive in those minds. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, carved from mammoth ivory 40,000 years ago, stands 31 centimeters tall and has the body of a human being and the head of a cave lion. Someone took the two most significant categories of being in their world, the human and the apex predator, and combined them into a figure that was neither and somehow both. This is not a creature that exists. This is a conceptual creation, a being that can only exist in the imagination. The carving of it required the ability to conceive of categories and then transcend them, to imagine a being that participates in multiple natures simultaneously, to think about the relationship between human and animal in a way that was not purely practical, but was metaphysical. What does it mean to be human? How does being human relate to being animal? What are the boundaries of these categories, and what lies beyond them? Those are philosophical questions. The Lion Man is the answer of one person or one community, working in ivory 40,000 years ago, to questions that still don't have final answers. The questions were alive then. They're alive now. The conversation, interrupted by 40,000 years of silence, is the same conversation. There is one more thing the 50,000 missing years can tell us, and it's perhaps the most uncomfortable. Because we've been talking mostly about the impressive things, the art, the music, the migrations, the philosophy, the social complexity, the knowledge systems. And all of that is real and all of it is important. But the 50,000 missing years also contain the full range of human behavior, not just the things we want to celebrate. And being honest about that is part of taking those people seriously as people rather than as idealized archetypes. Violence was part of those years. The skeletal evidence tells this story consistently. Individuals from the Paleolithic period show evidence of traumatic injury, some of it clearly interpersonal in origin. Skulls with marks from blunt impacts, bones with embedded projectile points, healed fractures consistent with blows from clubs or thrown stones. Some of these injuries are from accidents, falls, animal attacks, the ordinary physical dangers of a world without modern medicine. But some of them are not accidents. Some of them are the marks of deliberate violence between human beings. This is not surprising. Violence is a human universal, as consistent across cultures as language and music and religion, though its specific forms and frequencies vary enormously by culture, circumstance, and social organization. The people of the 50,000 missing years were not peaceful innocents existing in a violence-free world before the corrupting influence of civilization. They were people with all the capacity for both cooperation and conflict that being people entails. There is debate about how much interpersonal and group violence was present in the Paleolithic. Some researchers reading the archaeological evidence and the comparative data from hunter-gatherer societies studied in the historical period argue that violence was relatively rare and constrained, that the social structures of hunter-gatherer societies tended to regulate and limit conflict through the mechanisms of reciprocity and reputation. Others argue that the evidence for violence is substantial and that idealized portrayals of pre-agricultural life as fundamentally peaceful are not supported by the data. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle and varied considerably by region, by period, by specific social circumstances. What we can say with confidence is that the 50,000 missing years were not a golden age of harmony any more than they were a barbaric darkness. They were a human time, with human capacities for both good and terrible things in full operation. Hierarchy was likely present, though its forms were different from what emerged with agriculture and the state. Hunter-gatherer societies studied in the historical period show considerable variation in the degree of social stratification, from highly egalitarian societies with strong leveling mechanisms that prevented any individual from accumulating too much power, or status to societies with more pronounced hierarchies based on skill, age, gender, or lineage. The evidence from the Paleolithic archaeological record includes burials like Sunghir that suggest significant social differentiation, with some individuals receiving burial treatment that required enormous collective labor investment, while others were buried more simply. The social landscape of the 50,000 missing years was not flat. There were differences of status and power and authority, expressed in ways that left material traces wherever those traces survived. Fear was part of those years. Constant, intimate, physical fear of the kind that most people in modern, industrialized societies rarely experience. Fear of the dark in a world where the dark was genuinely dangerous, where the sounds outside the firelight might be a cave lion. Fear of starvation in a world where a bad season or a hunting failure could mean going hungry in ways that killed people. Fear of injury in a world where a deep cut or a broken bone, minor medical problems in the modern world, could be life-ending. Fear of the other, of the stranger from the neighboring group whose intentions could not be certain, in a world where strangers were sometimes trading partners and sometimes raiders. The fear was real. It shaped the bodies and the behavior of the people who lived with it, just as the chronic, low-level stress of modern life shapes our bodies and behavior. And it was the fear of those specific things, the dark, the predator, the stranger, the injury, the starvation, that the architecture of the underground cities in Cappadocia and the defensive design of every fortified settlement in human history was built to manage. Fear doesn't begin with civilization. Fear is older than we are in our current form. What civilization changes is the specific things we fear and the specific techniques we use to manage the fear. The fear itself is 50,000 years old and more. Understanding all of this, the violence and the hierarchy and the fear alongside the art and the music and the philosophical questioning and the extraordinary courage, is what it means to take the people of the 50,000 missing years seriously as people. Not as symbols of a lost golden age, not as evidence for a particular theory about human nature, as essentially cooperative or essentially competitive. Not as a blank screen onto which we project whatever we wish human nature had been, but as people, complicated, capable, frightened, brilliant, cruel, generous, curious, afraid, hoping people, exactly like us, living in a different world, doing their best with what they had, leaving their hands on cave walls so that something of them would remain. Let me end where we began, in the dark. Not the dark of a cave, though we've spent a lot of time there across this conversation. The dark of a night, any of the 18,000 nights that make up a single human lifetime, any of the millions upon millions of nights that make up the 50,000 missing years. A fire, the people gathered around it, the sky above them. We cannot hear them. We've been honest about that throughout this conversation. The voices are gone, the languages are gone, the stories are gone in their specific form. But we can infer some things with confidence because human beings are consistent in certain fundamental ways across all the distances of time and culture. And those consistencies show up in the archaeological record and in the biology that underlies all of it. There was a fire because fire is one of our species' oldest companions, controlled and used for warmth and light and cooking, for at least 400,000 years, possibly longer. There were people around the fire because human beings are social animals whose evolutionary history has wired them for group life, for the specific safety of proximity to others who share your interests, for the particular comfort of known faces in firelight. There was a night sky above, the same sky we can see now, the same stars in their courses, the Pleiades rising in the east, Orion in his place, the Milky Way in its slow wheel across the dark. And those people had the same eyes for patterns that we have, and the same brain that finds patterns whether they're there or not, and the same impulse to tell stories about the patterns they found. And we know, because the impulse is as fundamental as any impulse in the species, that they talked. That someone said something that made others laugh. That someone said something that fell into a silence that felt different from ordinary silence. The silence of something true having been said. That a child who had been restless and fidgeting was suddenly still and listening, held by the spell of a story. That the fire popped and settled and someone added wood and the light jumped and the faces around it were briefly illuminated in their specificity. This face And this face, and this face, each one familiar, each one beloved or complicated or both at once, the way the faces we've known for a long time always are. We know that some of those people were afraid of things, that they lay awake sometimes in the dark with the weight of a particular fear pressing on them, that they also experienced sometimes the sudden lifting of fear when a difficult season ended or a danger passed, the specific quality of relief that is one of the most physical of human experiences, the way the body actually feels different in the aftermath of sustained fear when the fear lifts, the lightness, the almost giddiness. We know that they grieved, that they had rituals for grief, because grief is universal across human cultures, and ritual is the universal human response to experiences too large and too disorienting to be absorbed without ceremony. We know that they marked death with something, some gesture, some placement, some pigment, some recognition that a person had been here and was now not here, and that this difference mattered and deserved acknowledgement. The burials at Sung here with their 3,000 ivory beads are not unusual in kind, only in degree. The care itself, the deliberate placement of a body, the things left with it for wherever it was going, that care shows up everywhere modern humans have left archaeological traces. It is perhaps the most consistent single feature of our species across all the variation of culture and technology and time. We mark our dead. We refuse to treat them as simply objects. We insist, even in the most difficult circumstances, that something about a person does not end with their last breath, that the relationship continues in some form, that the gesture of ceremony matters even when no living person can benefit from it. That insistence is 50,000 years old. It is possibly what makes us most specifically human in the sense that matters. We know that they wondered about the sky. Specifically and necessarily, they wondered about the sky, because the sky was where the light came from, and the rain came from, and the cold came from, because the sky was the environment of existence in its largest sense, because human beings have always looked up and tried to understand what was there, and why it behaved as it did, and what it had to do with human life. All of this is inference, but it is inference so strongly supported by the universals of human biology and human culture across all observable examples that it approaches certainty. Human beings everywhere, in every time period we can observe, do these things. Talk, laugh, fear, grieve, wonder, tell stories. Make ceremony, build relationships with the sky. The people of the 50,000 missing years were doing all of it. We simply can't hear them doing it. And when you lie down tonight, in whatever dark you have available, on whatever surface is comfortable, and you feel the particular quality of nighttime quiet that has been with humans for longer than human beings have existed in their current form, you're doing something that has been done by every human being who ever lived. In a cave with painted animals on the walls, in a grass hut on the savannah, on a hide sleeping mat in an ice age winter, with the sound of wind outside and the smell of the fire dying down, and the breathing of the people nearby slow and steady in the dark. In the hold of a raft, crossing a 60-kilometer stretch of open ocean toward a continent no one has seen, uncertain of what the morning will bring, uncertain of anything except the necessity of continuing. Every human being who ever lived knew this moment, the day releasing, the body surrendering, the mind beginning the slow drift toward the country of sleep. The 50,000 missing years aren't really missing. They're here in your body, in the architecture of your nervous system, in the way darkness and quiet signal to every biological system in you that it is time to rest. They're in your children's need for stories at bedtime, in your own need for the particular quality of stillness that makes sleep possible. They're in the Neanderthal DNA some of you carry, in the patterns of your dreams, in the specific ache of looking at a night sky and feeling that it means something, even in the absence of any framework that explains what the meaning is. You are the latest chapter in a story that began long before anyone knew how to write it down. You are the answer, inconceivably delayed, to the handprint on the cave wall. I was here, and here you are 50,000 years later. Still here, still human. Still lying down at the end of the day in your own dark. Still surrendering to the same ancient biological necessity as every person who ever pressed their hand against cold stone and blew red pigment around it and left their mark in the permanent dark. That chain of surrender, that daily yielding to the biological necessity of sleep, runs unbroken from you back through every ancestor you have ever had, through the first farmers and the last hunter-gatherers, and the people who crossed the ocean, and the people who survived the volcanic winter, all the way back to the first person who was fully, recognizably, completely human, and lay down at the end of a day in whatever darkness was available and let the day go. You are the continuation of that chain. You are the most recent link in something that has never been broken. Every night you sleep, you are doing what every human being before you has done. Every night you sleep, you are connected to all of them. They were talking about you, not you specifically, not knowing your name or your face, but you, the future, the possibility of the future, the prayer that the future would exist and would remember. The ceremony in the dark was for you. The art on the cave wall was for you. The crossing of the ocean and the survival of the volcanic winter and the navigation of the glacial maximum were, in some sense, for you. Something changes in you after you've spent real time with the 50,000 missing years. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. But it's there, a quiet shift in how you hold the story of humanity. A sense of depth beneath the story you thought you knew. A feeling that the foundation goes further down than you realized, that the roots of what we are reach back into a darkness so old that the oldest written texts are practically recent, practically this morning. And with that shift comes something else, a kind of respect, or something stronger than respect, for the people who lived in those years. For the woman who painted her hand on the cave wall in France 30,000 years ago. For the people who paddled their raft across 60 kilometers of open ocean toward a continent they had never seen. For the survivors of the Toba winter, the ones who maintained the cultural threads that needed to survive for our species to rebuild from whatever remained when the ash stopped falling. For the musicians who made flutes from bone 40,000 years ago and played music that we will never hear, but that was real, that moved the people who heard it in ways we can only guess at. These people deserve better than the dismissal embedded in the word prehistoric. They deserve better than the assumption that because they didn't write things down, nothing worth knowing was happening. They were full human beings, with all the complexity and richness and sorrow and joy that entails. And they lived, most of them, without any realistic possibility of being remembered by name or story in any future that could know them. They lived, and they were afraid sometimes, and they were courageous sometimes, and they loved people who died and grieved them, and eventually died themselves, and were grieved in turn. They built knowledge that their children needed and passed it on as carefully as they could. They looked up at the same stars we look at and wondered about them. The 50,000 missing years aren't a prelude to the real story. They are most of the story. They are where most of human experience happened in the time before we had the means to preserve it in ways that outlast the fragility of memory and organic material and oral tradition. And understanding this, really sitting with it, changes what it means to be human now. It means you're not just the product of 10,000 years of recorded history. You're the product of 60,000 years or more of human life, human struggle, human knowledge, human art. You carry in your body and your mind the residue of all of it. The fears that woke people in the night before agriculture. The skills that navigated people across unknown oceans. The stubbornness that survived volcanic winters and glacial maximums, and the extinction of the animals you had always hunted. You are deep. You come from deep. And the 50,000 years that are missing from most history books are the deepest part of you. If this conversation held you, if the handprint on the cave wall, the music in the bone flute, the open ocean crossing in the dark, if any of it reached you and made the world feel wider and stranger and more worth paying attention to, then please subscribe. Not for the metrics, though the metrics matter for what a channel like this can do. Subscribe because there is so much more of this story still to tell. There are discoveries being made right now in caves in Indonesia and South Africa and Siberia and Australia that are changing the shape of what we know about those 50,000 years. There are ancient genomes being sequenced from bone fragments smaller than your fingernail that contain information about human migration and population history that rewrites the textbooks. There are oral traditions still being documented, ecological knowledge still being recorded before the last holders of it are gone, astronomical traditions still being analysed, all of it adding pieces to the picture of who we were in the years before history began. We're still reading the cave wall, we're not close to the end of it. If you want to keep reading it with us, subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I check the comments, and there is something that I find genuinely moving about knowing that people from everywhere, in their own darkness, in their own night, are lying down with these stories and finding them worth the quiet hour before sleep. Because that's what these stories are for. Not to alarm or to frighten, but to expand the sense of what you are, to push the horizons of your own humanity back into the deep time where they actually belong, to send you to sleep knowing that you come from further and deeper and older than you thought. The 50,000 missing years aren't gone. They're just waiting to be found. And every person who finds a piece of them and carries it forward, who tells someone else what they learned, who pauses for a moment to register the reality of a handprint on a cave wall rather than walking past it as a curiosity, is doing something the person who pressed their hand against that stone would recognize. They are saying, I was here. I am real. I remember you. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. Sleep in the knowledge that you come from further than you thought, that the roots of what you are go down into a darkness older than agriculture and older than cities and older than writing, into a world where people fully human in every sense made art and music and ceremony and love and philosophy and grief in the absence of any institutional support, with only the tools available to them and the minds that had been given to them and the specific, brilliant, terrible, beautiful challenge of being fully conscious in a world that didn't explain itself. A world that was dangerous and cold and unpredictable. A world in which a child could be buried with 3,000 ivory beads sewn to their clothing with 10,000 hours of communal labour, because the people who loved that child refused to let them go unremarked. A world in which someone sat in the total darkness of a cave with fire in their hand and made a painting so beautiful that it moves us 40,000 years later. That world made you. That world is inside you. And tonight, as you settle into your own darkness, that world is closer than it usually seems. You come from those people. They are not distant strangers. They are not aliens. They are the direct and unbroken line of ancestors stretching back through every generation to the people who crossed the ocean to Australia, and the people who survived the volcanic winter, and the people who painted their hands on cave walls in the dark. Their blood is your blood in ways both literal and metaphorical. Their fears echo in your nervous system. Their love of fire and story and gathering is your love of fire and story and gathering. Their grief is the grief you know in your own body. Their wondering is your wondering, the same questions, the same disorienting awareness of existence, looking at itself in the dark and asking, in whatever language it has available, what this is and why. The 50,000 missing years are not over. They're not done with us. They're the foundation we stand on, the deep past that made the present possible, the long story that we're still in the middle of and will never see the end of from inside. And the specific human qualities we most need now: the resilience, the adaptability, the capacity to navigate catastrophe without losing what matters most. Those qualities were shaped and tested and refined across those 50,000 years. We carry them. We don't always know we do, but they're there, available, waiting to be called on. Tonight, in whatever darkness you're lying in, the full length of that story is with you. Every person who ever lay down at the end of the day and surrendered to sleep, every person who ever stared at the ceiling in the dark before closing their eyes and found in that moment of surrender something like peace, they're all here. 40,000 generations breathing with you. The handprint on the wall is still pressed. The flute note is still resonating somewhere in the stone. The fire is still warm. The stars are still turning overhead. The story is still going. You're still in it. Sleep well.